The United States Army Field Manual was precise on this point. Soldiers would carry issued weapons, issued ammunition, issued gear, nothing more, nothing less. Any firearm, blade, or device not explicitly authorized by unit command was subject to immediate confiscation. The soldier carrying it faced formal reprimand, reduction in rank, or courts-martial proceedings. That was the regulation. Here is what the regulation could not account. For a 22-year-old rifleman in a flooded Belgian tree line in December 1944, his M1 Garand jammed solid with ice and mud, listening to movement closing in from 30 yards. His issued weapon, useless. His issued sidearm, not issued to infantry at all. What he had tucked inside his field jacket, taken from a farmhouse outside Liège, reported to no one was the only reason he walked out of that tree line. The Army called weapons like that contraband. The men who carried them called them something else entirely. This is the record of 10 forbidden weapons that GIs smuggled past their own command, pulled from after-action reports, regimental diaries, and the kind of court-martial transcripts that military archivists rarely volunteer to show you. Not legend, not folklore. Documentation. 10 weapons, 10 violations. And in almost every case, the same brutal, simple justification. It kept them alive. Number 10. The Welrod pistol, the gun that was never there. By every official measure, the Welrod did not exist in the hands of conventional infantry. Designed by the British Special Operations Executive and manufactured in limited numbers, beginning in 1942, it was a bolt-action, magazine-fed, suppressed pistol single-shot, reload by hand, effective range under 25 yards. Command designated it strictly for OSS operatives and SOE agents behind enemy lines. Standard infantry had no authorization to carry one. Full stop. What the authorization memos did not anticipate soldiers' talk. OSS operatives moved through the same staging areas as conventional units. Equipment changed hands in the informal economy of the frontline rations, cigarettes, German, Lugers, and occasionally one of these. A Welrod turning up in a line infantryman's kit was not impossible. It was documented in at least 2 Ninth Army after-action reviews as unauthorized, suppressed device, origin unconfirmed. The Army's response was not curiosity. It was confiscation and a notation in the soldier's service record. The reason men wanted one was not complicated. In close reconnaissance, in night patrol, work. In the kind of situations where a standard-issue pistol shot announces your position to every enemy within 300 yards, the Welrod's near-silent report was not a luxury. It was a tactical argument that no field manual had an answer for. The Army took them away anyway. Number 9. The Liberator FP-45 too cheap to be taken. Seriously, too useful to be ignored. The Liberator was, by almost any engineering standard, an embarrassment. Stamped from sheet metal and under a minute of production time per unit, single-shot 45 ACP, with a smoothbore barrel accurate to roughly 8 feet. The Office of Strategic Services had 1 million of them manufactured in 1942 at a unit cost of $2.10. The intent was mass airdrop over occupied Europe. Drop them to resistance fighters. Let them close the distance on a German soldier, one shot, take his weapon, disappear. They were never meant for American GIs, which is precisely why some American GIs wanted them. Not as a primary weapon, not even as a reliable backup, as a last resort so small it disappeared into the lining of a field jacket, something that did not print against the serre. Body did not add weight to a man already carrying 60 pounds of kit. A sergeant, attached to the 1st Infantry Division, was documented in a 1943 disciplinary report, carrying one in North Africa. Reasoning recorded verbatim in the file. In the event of capture, sir, 1 round is sufficient. Command did not find this persuasive. The Liberator was confiscated. The sergeant was reprimanded. He was also, notably, never captured. Now, before we go further, consider the position these men were actually in. The regulation said, carry what you're given. Trust the supply chain. Trust that the men behind desks in Washington had anticipated every scenario a soldier might face in a Belgian tree line, or a North African wadi, or a Pacific atoll at 2 in the morning. If your life were on the line, and the weapon in your hands had already failed you once, would you trust that regulation? Or would you trust the thing that actually worked? Hold that thought. Because the next items on this list made that choice considerably more complicated. Number 8. The trench knife M1000, 918 banned by treaty, carried by thousands. This requires some precision because the history is frequently misrepresented. The M1000, 918 trench knife, a double-edged 7-inch blade with a cast brass knuckle duster handle, was not banned because it was ineffective. It was banned because of the Hague Convention's provisions regarding weapons designed to cause unnecessary suffering. The knuckle duster configuration, combined with the blade geometry, was interpreted by the Judge Advocate General's office in 1943 as potentially violating those provisions in close quarters application. An internal memo recommended against its reissue for the quoter's European theater specifically. The Army did not widely publicize this memo. What the Army did was quietly discontinue formal reissue of the M1918 in favor of the M3 fighting knife, a cleaner, legally safer blade with no knuckle guard. Soldiers who already owned M1918s or who acquired them through the informal channels that define every war ever fought were not systematically disarmed. But carrying one into a theater where the memo applied was technically a violation. Veteran accounts from the 82nd Airborne, the 101st, and multiple Ranger battalions document the M1918 appearing in Normandy, in the Hurtgen Forest, in the Ardennes, not as a curiosity, as a working tool. The men who carried it were not making a philosophical statement about international law. They were making a practical one about what happens in the dark, at arm's length, when noise is not an option. Number 7. The captured Luger P8, the enemy's sidearm as standard issue. There is a specific irony embedded in this entry. The Luger P8 was, by 1944, already considered outdated by the Wehrmacht itself, partially replaced by the Walther P38, more expensive to manufacture, more sensitive to field conditions than the Army's own procurement officers preferred. German command was moving away from it. American soldiers were moving toward it. The reasons were not sentimental, despite what post-war souvenir narratives suggest. In the European theater, captured German ammunition was frequently more accessible than resupply from the Allied rear. A soldier, cut off from his unit, operating in broken terrain, facing a resupply chain that had been shelled, strafed, or simply delayed by the catastrophic logistics of a winter offensive. That soldier's calculation about ammunition was not theoretical. It was immediate. A Luger P8 chambered in 9mm parabellum could be fed from captured German stores, from dead enemy soldiers, from overrun supply points. An M1911 could not. Command's position was unambiguous. Carrying captured enemy weapons created identification hazards, friendly fire risk when silhouettes blurred at distance, risk of being misidentified as the enemy during confused close-quarters engagements. The prohibition was genuine, and the reasoning was not entirely without merit. What command could not legislate away was the arithmetic of survival. A corporal in the 4th Infantry Division was brought before a summary court-martial in January 1945 near the Siegfried Line, charged with carrying an unauthorized Luger P8 and approximately 60 rounds of captured 9mm ammunition. The proceedings record his defense in 4 words. My 45 was gone. Charges were reduced. He was returned to the line. he still had the Luger. Number 6. The shotgun legal to own, illegal to use. This entry requires a careful distinction that most accounts collapse together, and, collapsing, it misrepresents what actually happened. The pump-action shotgun, specifically the Winchester Model 1897 and the Remington Model 11 inches, its military configuration was not prohibited from American inventory. The United States Army used shotguns in both World Wars. They were issued to guards, to rear area security personnel, to specific jungle warfare units in the Pacific. The weapon itself was not the problem. The problem was the Hague Convention of 1899. Germany formally protested American use of the Model 1897 inches World War I, arguing that its spread pattern and expanding projectile effect violated prohibitions on weapons, causing unnecessary suffering. The United States rejected that protest. The legal question was never formally resolved. Entering the Second World War, the shotgun existed in a documented gray zone present in American inventory, used in specific authorized contexts, but subject to challenge under international law if deployed in conventional infantry engagements against German forces, specifically. In the Pacific theater, this ambiguity was largely irrelevant. Japan did not invoke Hague Convention provisions in the same manner. Marines and Army infantry in the Pacific used shotguns in jungle fighting with minimal institutional friction, close terrain, dense vegetation. Engagements at ranges where a 12-gauge pattern was not just effective but arguably the optimal solution. In the European theater, it was different. Soldiers who acquired shotguns through stateside connections, through supply channel irregularities, through the same informal economies that moved Wellrods and Liberators and carried them against German forces, were operating in explicit violation of standing guidance. Several after-action reports from the Italian campaign document shotguns appearing in infantry units with no authorization trail. One regimental commander's memo, dated March 1944, refers to the shotgun problem without further elaboration, suggesting the issue was sufficiently common to require no introduction. The men carrying them were not legal scholars. They were men who had cleared enough buildings to understand what a 12-gauge does in a 6-foot hallway, and had made their decision accordingly. And here is where this history stops being about gear and starts being about something harder. Every man on this list made a choice, not in comfort, not with time to deliberate, in the compressed, irreversible moment where doctrine ends and reality begins. The regulation said one thing, the ground said another, and in that gap, in that specific, freezing, terrifying gap, these men decided that survival was not a violation. Right or wrong is not a useful framework for what happened in those moments. The only framework that fits is this: they were there, and the men writing the regulations were not. Number 5. The Browning high-power Allied weapon, wrong army. The Browning high-power is a precise case study in how bureaucratic boundaries dissolve under fire. Designed by John Browning and completed by Dieudonné Saïve, the high-power entered service with the Belgian Army in 1935. When Belgium fell in 1940, the Germans seized the FN Herstal factory and continued production, meaning the same pistol was simultaneously in service with the Wehrmacht, with captured Allied stocks, with the British Army through Canadian manufacture, and circulating through the European black market in quantities that no quartermaster's ledger fully captured. For American GIs, the high power occupied an odd legal position. It was not a German weapon. It was not American issue. It was an Allied design manufactured in some configurations by friendly forces and in others by the enemy. Command guidance on captured high powers was inconsistent at best. Some units treated them as authorized Allied equipment, others as unauthorized captured weapons subject to confiscation. What made the high power desirable was the 13-round magazine. The M1911 carried 7 rounds, plus 1 in the chamber. in the close urban fighting that defined the liberation of France and the push into Germany street by street, building by building, stairwell by stairwell. The difference between 7 rounds and 13 was not a footnote. It was a reload that either happened or did not. A first lieutenant attached to the 30th Infantry Division filed a requisition in September 1944 attempting to formally authorize high powers for his platoon. The requisition was denied. The reasoning cited was supply chain standardization. The Army could not guarantee 9mm resupply at scale. The lieutenant's platoon carried them anyway. The resupply problem, it turned out, was solved the same way the corporal with the Prybo. Luger solved it from the ammunition of men who no longer needed it. Number 4. The flamethrower M1A1 authorized in theory, condemned in practice. The M1A1 portable flamethrower was not contraband in the conventional sense. The United States Army issued it, trained men to use it, deployed it in both the Pacific and European theaters with official sanction. On paper, it was as authorized as the M1, Garand, or the Bar. The problem was what happened after the shooting stopped. The Geneva Convention of 1929 did not explicitly prohibit flamethrowers. Legal review, within the Judge Advocate General's office, had examined the question and returned a carefully worded non-answer. The weapon was not prohibited, but its use against personnel in specific circumstances, particularly against soldiers attempting to surrender, raised questions that the existing legal framework did not cleanly resolve. This review was internal. It was not widely distributed. The men carrying flamethrowers into Pacific atolls and European bunker lines were not briefed on it. What they were told, increasingly, in the latter stages of the Pacific campaign, was this: certain field applications of the flamethrower, specifically directed use against fortified positions containing both combatants and non-combatants, or against enemy, wounded, were being flagged by theater command for post-action review. Post-action review. In a war. For men who had 60 seconds to decide whether a bunker was still a threat. The soldiers who carried M1A1s into Iwo Jima, into Palaliu, into the cave systems of Okinawa were not making tactical choices that existed in a legal vacuum. They were making them in real time, under fire, against an enemy whose doctrine of resistance unto death made the conventional calculus of surrender and quarter almost entirely inapplicable. Several flamethrower operators from the 4th and 5th Marine Divisions were subject to informal inquiry following Iwo Jima. Not courts-martial, not formal charges, but the IVT2.MIE2 kind of command-level questioning that leaves a mark on a service record without appearing in the official casualty summary. The weapon was authorized. The manner of its use, in the specific circumstances these men faced, existed in a gray zone that command acknowledged privately and avoided publicly. Let that settle for a moment, because as we move toward the final 2 items on this list, the answer to the question of what these men carried and why shifts from discipline risk to something the Army found genuinely harder to manage. Not a courts-martial offense, not a confiscation, notation in a service file. A decision that command could neither fully authorize nor fully condemn because acknowledging it in either direction required admitting what the war had actually become. On the ground. Number 3. The Liberator's successor, the Deer Gun, and the program that disappeared. Most histories of covert American weapons development in the Second World War begin and end with the Liberator FP-45. The follow-on project receives considerably less attention, partly because it arrived late, partly because its documentation trail was deliberately obscured, and partly because the Central Intelligence Agency, which inherited the program's files, did not consider their release a priority for several decades. The Deer Gun was developed in 1964, but its conceptual lineage runs directly through a series of late-war OSS procurement requests from 1944 and 1945 that called for an NSS.com improved single-shot covert pistol addressing the Liberator's primary failure, its requirement for user familiarity with firearms to operate safely under stress. Those 1,944 procurement requests did not result in a fielded weapon before the war ended. What they resulted in was a design framework, a set of aluminum casting, specifications, and a small number of prototype units, fewer than 30, by the most credible archival estimate that were distributed to OSS forward elements in the NK Plate European theater in the final months of the war. These prototypes had no official designation. They do not appear in standard weapons inventories. They appear, obliquely, in 3 separate OSS field reports from early 1945, referenced as the replacement device in 2 of them, and in the third, more specifically, as the aluminum pistol, undesignated. Soldiers who received them received no paperwork, no authorization trail, no serial number cross-reference in any record that has been declassified. They were given a weapon that, by every administrative measure, did not exist by an agency that, at that point in history, also officially did not exist to use in circumstances that were never going to appear in any after-action report. The deer gun that was eventually manufactured in the 1960s is documented, photographed, held in collections. Its wartime predecessor exists almost entirely in the gap between what the OSS requested and what the war ended before delivering. Almost entirely. One example surfaced in a 2003 estate sale in rural Pennsylvania. The seller was the grandson of a man who had served in OSS forward operations in Germany in 1945. The pistol aluminum frame, no markings, single shot, .30 caliber, was examined by 2 independent firearms historians before being acquired by a private collector. Neither historian could match it to any documented production run. The collector has not made it available for further examination. Some things the Army buried stay buried. Number 2. The sleeve gun, the weapon that never left the building. There is a specific category of forbidden weapon that is harder to document than contraband carried by frontline soldiers, the weapon that was developed, tested, and deployed entirely within the classified architecture of the OSS, with no paperwork crossing into conventional military channels, no serial numbers entering standard inventory, and no formal acknowledgement from any command level that it existed at all. The sleeve gun sits in that category. Developed by the OSS Technical Services Division, the same unit responsible for the Pronet, Liberator's procurement, and a catalog of devices that reads more like industrial fiction than military history. The sleeve gun was a single-shot firearm designed to be worn strapped to the forearm beneath a jacket sleeve. Spring-loaded firing mechanism triggered by a sharp forward extension of the wrist. Chambered in, .22 caliber. Effective. Range. Close enough that caliber was irrelevant. It was not designed for combat in the conventional sense. It was designed for assassination specifically, for operatives in situations where a standard concealed firearm would be detected by search, where body contact with the target was operationally guaranteed, and where the operative needed a firing solution that required no visible draw. The OSS Technical Services records, partially declassified through Freedom of Information, requests beginning in the 1990s confirm prototype development and limited field issuance. The number of units produced is listed in one document as sufficient for forward requirements, a phrase that tells you exactly nothing while confirming that someone, somewhere, decided requirements existed. What the records do not contain is a single after-action account of its use. This is not unusual for OSS covert operations. It is, however, worth noting that the absence of documentation for a weapon specifically designed to leave no evidence trail is not the same as evidence of absence. The men who carried sleeve guns into occupied Europe in 1944 and 1945 were not writing field reports about it. They were not debriefed in rooms where transcripts were kept. Their operations existed in the deliberate negative space that the OSS constructed around its most sensitive activities. Several OSS veterans, interviewed decades after the war by independent historians, referenced a wrist device in terms sufficiently consistent across separate accounts to suggest common experience rather than shared myth. None of them described it in detail. Most of them changed the subject. Some weapons leave no record because they failed. Some leave no record because they worked exactly as intended, and the men who used them understood with perfect clarity that the record was the risk. And now we reach the end of this list. Number 1. The entry that required the most careful verification. The one where the archival trail is thinnest, not because the evidence doesn't exist, but because multiple agencies across multiple decades made deliberate decisions about what would and would not enter the public record. Number 1. The Sedgley OSS. 38 glove pistol, the last thing you would ever see. Begin with what is confirmed. The Sedgley OSS 38 glove pistol is not legend. It is a documented, physically surviving artifact. Examples exist in the collection of the National Firearms Museum in Fairfax, Virginia, and in at least 2 private collections with verified provenance. It was manufactured by R.F. Sedgley, Incorporated, of Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, under contract to the United States Navy. The production number most frequently cited by firearms historians is approximately 50 units, though some archival estimates place Sanharas.com it higher. The mechanism was precise in its brutality. A .38 caliber single-shot pistol mounted to the back of a leather glove, barrel forward, triggered by a spring-loaded plunger that fired on direct impact, meaning the weapon discharged when the wearer delivered a punch to the target. Contact range. No draw. No visible weapon until the moment of use. And by that point, the moment had already passed. The Navy issued it to specific underwater demolition teams, the frogmen who conducted pre-invasion reconnaissance and obstacle clearance ahead of amphibious landings. The operational logic was specific. UDT personnel working in close proximity to enemy coastal defenses, in situations where capture was a near certainty, if detected, needed a contact range weapon that could be deployed without the motor sequence of reaching for a holster. The glove pistol eliminated the draw entirely. This is where the confirmed record becomes instructive about what surrounds it. 50 units, or thereabouts, manufactured for a specialized naval unit. A weapon so operationally specific that its authorization was never extended beyond that narrow context. And yet veteran accounts, regimental histories, and 3 separate OSS field reports from the European theater between 1943 and 1945 reference what one document describes as the contact device, glove-mounted in contexts that have nothing to do with underwater demolition teams. A contact weapon, designed to be invisible, deployed in occupied cities, in agent, meetings gone wrong, in the kind of close-quarters intelligence work where the difference between a concealed weapon and a visible one was the difference between completing the mission and becoming the mission's casualty. How those units move from naval inventory into OSS field operations is not documented in any record that has been released. The procurement pathway, if one existed on paper at all, has not surfaced in 60 years of archival declassification. What has surfaced is this. In 2009, a researcher examining OSS personnel files at the refouled my24.org guide, National Archives identified a requisition request dated November 1943 for 12 units, contact fire, glove-mounted, Ref. Sedgley, submitted by an OSS section chief, operating out of London. The request carries an approval notation in a second hand. The approving officer's name is redacted. The destination field is blank. 12 glove pistols. Approved. Sent somewhere. Used by someone, against someone, in circumstances that the United States government has declined to specify for more than 80 years. That is not a gap in the record. That is the record, and someone made a decision long ago that this particular page of it would stay exactly as blank as it needed to be. 10 weapons, 10 violations, and across every entry on this list, from the stamped sheet metal of a $2 pistol to a glove with a redacted destination field, the same architecture repeats itself with the precision of a pattern that was never meant to be visible. Command writes the regulation. The regulation describes a war that does not exist. The soldier enters the war that does and makes his adjustment in the space between those two realities. In the freezing dark, with whatever he has managed to acquire, conceal, and carry past the men who would have taken it from him. This is not a story about insubordination. It is not a story about soldiers who believe the rules did not apply to them. The men on this list, in almost every documented case, understood exactly what they were carrying and exactly what it would cost them if discovered. They carried it anyway, not from arrogance, not from ideology, but from the oldest and most ungovernable of human instincts, the will to still be here tomorrow. Doctrine is written for the average engagement, for the anticipated terrain, for the enemy behavior the planners modeled in offices, on maps, with information that was already weeks old by the time it reached the front. What doctrine cannot account for what no field manual in any army, in any war, has ever successfully accounted for is the specific, unrepeatable 45-second window in which a man discovers that the average engagement is not the one he is currently inside. In that window, the regulation becomes abstract. The weapon in his hand becomes concrete. And the choice documented in courts-martial transcripts, in redacted requisition forms, in estate sales and private collections and archival gaps that have remained carefully blank. For 8 decades, that choice tells you something about the distance between the war that was planned and the war that was actually fought. It is not a comfortable distance. If this kind of history, not the sanitized summary, but the documented record, with its redactions and its contradictions and its 45-second windows, if that is the history you came here for, then you already know why this channel exists. Next, we go deeper. The weapons on this list were forbidden by regulation, by treaty, by the quiet architecture of plausible deniability. The next investigation covers something narrower and considerably darker. The specific gear that soldiers brought home from the war that the United States government spent years trying to locate and recover, not for safety, not for legal compliance, but because of what those items, in the wrong hands and the wrong conversation, could prove about what actually happened in specific engagements that appear in the official record as something else entirely. That record exists. It is partial, it is contested, and it is waiting.